Leonard Hallberg was a man who lived for music and for himself. He was not just any pianist. He was one of the best in all of Europe. People called him a genius, a prodigy, a master. He played the piano like magic, and he knew it too. Maybe. That was the problem, he knew it too well. From the time he was 5, Leonard had been trained in the best schools in Vienna. His parents were wealthy, strict, and proud of him. They made sure he had the best piano, the best teachers, the best everything. And Leonard never disappointed them. By the age of 16, he was performing on big stages. By 30, he had already played in Paris, London, and New York. Now, at 42, he had become famous not only for his performances, but for his sharp tongue and proud attitude. He had no patience for beginners. No interest in people who didn't speak the language of Mozart and Beethoven. To him, music was not for everyone. It was for the trained, the serious, the elite. He believed that true talent needed expensive lessons and years of hard work. He believed that you had to be born into music, not just love it. That's why. When he was invited to give a piano masterclass at a small community center in a quiet town, he almost said no. He looked at the invitation and laughed. Why would I go to a place where no one has even heard of Rachmaninoff? He said to his assistant, but the invitation came with a large donation. Often Leonard loved money almost as much as he loved praise. So he agreed, thinking it would be a simple trip, a bit of talking, some basic lessons, and then back to Vienna. When he arrived at the center, he looked around with hidden disgust. The piano was old, the walls were plain. And the people looked like they had come from a picnic, not a music class. Children, teenagers, old men. Women in simple clothes, they all gathered to see the great Leonard Hallberg. He wore a black suit, shiny shoes, and a silver watch. He walked like he owned the building, even though it smelled slightly of soup and cleaning supplies. Leonard began his class with a short speech. He spoke about the importance of technique, of discipline, of perfect posture and finger control. He played a small piece to show off, fast, loud, and full of emotion. Everyone clapped, impressed. Except one woman in the back who just smiled softly. Her name was Clara, but Leonard didn't know that yet. He barely looked at her. She was wearing a plain apron and sitting near a mop bucket. He thought she was just a cleaner who had come in by accident. She sat quietly, listening, her hands resting calmly in her lap. When Leonard asked if anyone had questions, she raised her hand slowly. "Excuse me," she said gently. "How do you feel the music instead of just playing the notes?" Leonard stared at her for a second. Then he smiled, but not the nice kind of smile. It was the smile someone gives when they think a joke is too silly to answer. "My dear," he said, "let's leave the feeling to the trained performers." "Yes." The room chuckled nervously, and Clara said nothing more. As the class continued, Leonard kept showing off. He asked some of the students to come up and try, and he corrected them with sharp comments. "You're sitting like a sack of potatoes," he told one boy. "Are you trying to kill the piano?" He asked another who played too hard. The students laughed nervously. But some began to feel uncomfortable. Still, they all believed that was just how geniuses talked during the break. Leonard leaned against the piano and joked with the organizers. Next time, he said loud enough for others to hear, "Let's keep the cleaning staff out of the Q&A." He mimicked Clara's voice. "How do you feel the music?" His voice went high and soft, and a few people laughed. Clara, who had just stepped into the hallway, heard him. She stood still for a moment, then turned away and went back to her cleaning bucket. Leonard, proud of his little performance, felt no guilt. In his mind, he had reminded everyone of their place. He was the master, and they were here to watch and learn. He believed he had done them a favor by showing up at all. But what Leonard didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that the woman he had just mocked, the one with the mop and apron, was about to teach him something that all his years in concert halls never had. And when that moment came, everything he thought he knew about music. Pride and talent would change forever. Clara had always been someone people didn't notice. She liked it that way. She wore simple clothes, always kept her hair tied, and walked softly wherever she went, at the community center. Everyone knew her as Miss Clara, the kind woman who cleaned the floors, kept the chairs in order, and made sure the piano was dusted every morning. No one knew much about her life before she came to the town. They only knew she worked quietly, smiled politely, and never asked for anything. She had been working at the center for 3 years now. She arrived every morning before sunrise and stayed until the last light went off. People thought she was just another poor woman trying to make a living. Even the children who took classes there sometimes forgot to say thank you when she swept around them. But Clara never complained. She had seen too much in life to worry about little things like that. When she heard that a famous pianist named Leonard Hallberg was coming to teach a master class, she was curious. She had heard of his name before in newspapers, on radio shows, and from the posters that sometimes hung in music shops. People said he was brilliant, powerful, the best of the best. Clara didn't plan to watch his class. She thought she would just clean the hall early, then stay in the back to finish polishing the wood floors. She never expected to be part of anything, but that day, something felt different. She wore her best scarf, a soft cream-colored one her mother gave her many years ago. She took extra care cleaning the piano that morning, wiping every key with gentle hands. Then she quietly sat down on a folding chair in the back of the room, far from the front rows where the students sat. When Leonard walked in, the room suddenly felt tight. People sat up straighter, whispered excitedly, and clapped before he even said a word. He walked like someone used to being watched. His shoes were shiny, his hands smooth and graceful. He wore a black suit, and his silver watch caught the light every time he moved. Clara watched silently as he began to speak. He talked about music like it was a secret club, one only a few were allowed to join. His words were fancy, full of names of famous composers and technical terms that most people didn't understand. Still, the students nodded and smiled, trying their best to follow. Then he began to play. His fingers danced across the piano, fast and strong. The room filled with music so powerful it made people gasp. Clara listened closely, but something inside her felt a little empty. Yes, the music was perfect, but something about it didn't touch her heart. After he finished, Leonard asked if anyone had questions. People looked at each other nervously, unsure what to say. Clara didn't plan to speak, but her hand lifted before she could stop herself. She cleared her throat and asked in a soft voice, "Sir, how do you feel the music?" instead of just playing the notes. The room went quiet. Some people turned to see who had spoken, surprised that the cleaning lady had asked a question. Leonard looked at her, clearly not expecting someone like her to speak during his class. He stared for a moment, then gave a tight smile. "My dear," he said in a slow, mocking tone, "let's leave the feeling to the trained performers." Yes. A few people chuckled under their breath, unsure if they were supposed to laugh. Clara gave a small nod and lowered her eyes. She felt her face grow warm, but she said nothing more. Leonard moved on quickly, acting like her question didn't matter. To him, she was just a cleaner who had stepped out of her place, someone who didn't belong in a room full of real musicians. As the class went on, Clara quietly stood and walked toward the hallway. She picked up her mop and began wiping the floors. Her back turned to the room, but her mind was far away. It was back in Prague, in a small music school where she once taught students about emotion, not just technique. It was with her husband, who used to tell her, music without feeling is just noise. Meanwhile, inside the room, Leonard continued to speak with pride. He laughed and made jokes, even copying Clara's voice in a silly way. Some students laughed politely, though a few felt uncomfortable. Eva, a young teacher sitting near the front, glanced toward the hallway. She had seen Clara many times. Always kind, always quiet. Something about this moment didn't sit right with her. But Leonard didn't notice. He was too busy enjoying his own performance, the one where he was the star and everyone else was just part of the background. What he didn't know was that the quiet woman in the back, the one he had just mocked, had once lived a life filled with music more beautiful than anything he had ever played. And soon, she would remind him of something he had long forgotten. That music isn't only found in grand halls and fancy suits. Sometimes it lives in silence, in loss, in memory, and in the humble hands of someone the world has overlooked. The room was still buzzing after Leonard's dramatic piano demonstration. Students whispered to one another, excited to be in the presence of someone so famous. Many of them had only ever seen Leonard Hallberg on YouTube or read about him in magazines. Now, he was standing just a few feet away from them, correcting their hand positions, showing them new techniques. For some, it felt like a dream come true, but not everyone was smiling. A few students had noticed how Leonard had treated the older woman in the back, the cleaner. Clara, they didn't understand why he had laughed at her question or why he had copied her voice afterward. Still, most people kept quiet, afraid to say something. After all, Leonard was a legend, and they were just learners. During the short break between sessions, the students gathered in small groups. Sipping tea or checking their phones, Leonard stayed near the piano, enjoying the attention. A few young students came up to ask him about his favorite composers, and he answered with dramatic flair. He loved to hear himself speak, almost as much as he loved to hear himself play. Then someone mentioned Clara again. One boy whispered, "She's always here, but I didn't know she could speak like that." Leonard raised an eyebrow, then gave a wide grin. "Oh yes," he said in a playful tone. "Our dear Miss Mop has deep thoughts about music." The students laughed nervously, unsure if it was okay to laugh at a woman who had done nothing wrong. Leonard wasn't finished. He lifted his chin and began to mimic her voice. "Excuse me, maestro," he said in a high, soft tone. "How do you feel the music?" He added extra sweetness to the words, making her sound silly and foolish. Some students covered their mouths to hide their smiles. Others looked at the ground, feeling awkward. Eva, the young music teacher sitting nearby, didn't laugh. She felt a strange twist in her stomach. She had always believed that music was about kindness and expression, not just skill. Watching Leonard mock someone so gentle and quiet made her heart ache. She wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. It was hard to stand up to someone like Leonard Hallberg. Meanwhile, just outside the room, Clara had returned to her cleaning. She moved the mop slowly across the hallway floor, trying to focus on her work, but her hands were shaking slightly. She had heard everything, his voice, his joke. The laughter, it had all reached her ears like tiny stabs to the heart. She wasn't angry, not really. She was used to being overlooked, used to people thinking she didn't matter. But for some reason, this time hurt more. Maybe it was because she had dared to ask a question, to open a small piece of her heart, and instead of kindness, she received laughter as she cleaned. Memories floated through her mind like old photographs. She remembered being on stage in Prague, her fingers dancing across the keys. She remembered her students, their eager eyes, their mistakes, their joy. She remembered her husband, who used to sit in the front row during every performance, smiling with pride. All of it felt like a different life, a different world inside the room. Leonard sat down at the piano again and started playing a quick piece just to show off. His fingers moved fast, his face serious, but his heart was elsewhere, lost in his pride. He didn't notice the tension in the room or how a few students were now whispering, not in excitement, but in discomfort, to Leonard. Clara was just another part of the background, like a chair or a broom. He didn't know her story, her pain, or her past. He didn't care to ask. But what he failed to understand was that true music doesn't only live in hands that move fast. It lives in the heart, in the memories, in the pain. And Clara's heart held more music than he could imagine. Soon, something would happen that would turn the entire room upside down, a moment that would humble the proud maestro, a moment that would show everyone that greatness doesn't always wear a black suit and shiny shoes. Sometimes it wears old sneakers and carries a mop. And when Clara would finally touch the piano, even the walls would listen, because real music doesn't need a title, a trophy, or fame. It only needs truth, and Clara had more of it than anyone in that room. The day was slowly coming to an end. The students had finished their sessions with Leonard, some feeling proud, some feeling nervous. The masterclass had been full of big words, fast fingers, and a lot of clapping. Leonard looked satisfied, maybe even a little tired. He stood by the piano, arms crossed, ready to say a few final words before leaving. The small crowd gathered again in the hall. There was a kind of strange silence, now not the happy, excited kind from earlier. It felt like something was missing. But no one could say what it was. Maybe it was the way Leonard had laughed at Clara. Maybe it was the way she had quietly walked out and never returned to the room. Some people had noticed, but no one had spoken about it. Just then, Mr. Heller, the coordinator of the community center, stepped forward to thank Leonard. He smiled nervously, holding a clipboard in one hand and wiping his glasses with the other. "Thank you for the wonderful class, Maestro Hallberg," he said. "It's not every day we have someone like you here." Leonard gave a small bow, proud and polite. He was ready to leave, to get into his car and return to the hotel. But Mr. Heller paused for a moment and added, "Before you go, Maestro, there's something I think you should see." Leonard raised an eyebrow. "Yes." "Well," Mr. Heller said with a shy smile, "there's someone here at the center who plays a little. She's not trained, but people say she has a touch." Leonard looked puzzled. "A student?" No, Mr. Heller chuckled softly. "Clara, the woman who cleans here. She used to play long ago." For a moment, the room was quiet. Then someone from the crowd, maybe trying to lighten the mood, said jokingly, "Let her play a song, Maestro. It could be fun." A few people laughed, more out of nervousness than anything else. Leonard smirked and looked around, then shrugged. "Why not?" he said in a tone that was half serious and half mocking. "Let's hear what the mop lady can do." Some students glanced at one another, unsure how to feel. Eva, the young teacher, felt her heart beat faster. She wasn't sure if this was a mistake or a moment they would all remember. Mr. Heller stepped out of the room and returned a few moments later with Clara. She walked in slowly, her hands a little wet from cleaning, her apron still tied around her waist. She looked surprised to see everyone watching her, but her face was calm, as if she had already made peace with what was about to happen. Leonard stepped aside from the piano, giving a little bow. "Madame," he said playfully, "the stage is yours." Clara didn't speak. She walked over to the piano, gently removed her apron and placed it over a nearby chair. Then she sat down in front of the piano, her fingers hovering just above the keys. For a few seconds, she didn't move. The room was so quiet. You could hear the wind outside brushing against the windows. Leonard stood with his arms crossed, still smiling. He didn't expect anything special. He thought maybe she would plunk out a children's song or a simple melody at best. But the moment Clara touched the piano, everything changed. She didn't rush. She began with soft notes, flowing like water down a gentle stream. Her hands moved slowly, but with deep emotion. She was playing Chopin Nocturne in C-sharp minor, just with her fingers, but with her whole heart. The first few notes made people stop breathing for a second. There was something about the way she played. It wasn't just the music. It was the feeling behind it. It was sadness and beauty, strength and loss, all hidden inside. Those keys, Leonard's smile began to fade. He leaned forward slightly, no longer amused. He recognized the piece instantly, but he had never heard it like this. It was raw, honest, full of life and pain at the same time. Clara's eyes stayed closed as she played. Her fingers danced lightly, not with power, but with grace. She wasn't showing off, she was sharing something. Something deep and personal. She didn't care about the room, or Leonard, or what anyone thought. She was simply telling her story through the music. One of the students wiped a tear from her cheek. Another placed a hand on his chest. Feeling the music in his bones, Eva stood frozen, amazed, tears slowly filling her eyes. Even Mr. Heller looked like he was holding his breath when Clara finished. The last note hung in the air like a whisper. Then came silence, deep, powerful silence. No one clapped at first. Not because they weren't amazed, but because they were stunned. Something had shifted in the room. Something real and unforgettable. Clara slowly opened her eyes and stood up. She looked at no one in particular, gave a small nod, and stepped away from the piano. Her face was calm, peaceful, as if she had finally let go of something she had been holding in for years. And for the first time that day, Leonard had no words. The room was completely silent. No one moved, no one whispered. And even the sound of breathing seemed to stop. Clara sat quietly at the piano, her hands resting gently above the keys. For a moment, she didn't play anything. She just closed her eyes and breathed in slowly. It was like she was listening to something deep inside her heart. Something that didn't use words. Leonard stood nearby with his arms still crossed. But now his expression had changed. The smirk was gone, and his eyebrows were slightly pulled together. He had expected something simple, maybe even awkward, but Clara's stillness didn't feel like hesitation. It felt like preparation, as if something powerful was about to happen. Then her fingers touched the keys. The sound was soft, like a whisper in the dark. The first note floated in the air like a feather. And then came the second and the third. Each one fell perfectly into place, slow and smooth. She was playing Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor, but she wasn't just playing it, she was feeling it, breathing it, becoming it. People in the room leaned forward without realizing it. It was like they were being pulled closer by the music itself. It didn't sound loud or showy, but it touched something in everyone. Something quiet and deep. Something that words couldn't reach. Leonard took a step forward. He recognized the piece right away was one of his favorites. He had played it hundreds of times in his career, but this felt different. Clara's version wasn't perfect in the technical sense. She didn't play it like someone trying to impress. She played it like someone remembering something important. Something painful and beautiful at the same time. Her hands moved like they knew the keys by heart. Her fingers were gentle but sure, like they had done this 1,000 times before. But there was no pride in her face, no performance in her posture. She wasn't showing off. She was simply telling a story, a quiet, emotional story that needed no explanation. Eva, the young teacher, stood at the back of the room, completely still. Her eyes were wide and her mouth slightly open. She had never heard the piano sound like this. She had never felt music move through her body in such a soft and powerful way. She wiped away a tear that had slipped down her cheek without her noticing. One of the students, a boy who had earlier been scolded by Leonard, stared at Clara like she was a magician. He didn't understand much about music, but he knew what he was hearing was special. It made his chest feel tight, like something inside him was trying to wake up. Even Mr. Heller, the center's kind old coordinator, held his hands together. His eyes were glossy, and his shoulders slightly hunched forward. He had always known Clara was kind and hardworking, but he had never imagined this, never imagined that the same woman who swept the floors could create something so full of soul. And then there was Leonard. For the first time all day, he had nothing to say. He stood with his arms at his sides, watching every movement of Clara's hands. He listened carefully, his ears picking up every note, every pause, every breath between the phrases. He felt something he hadn't felt in years, not control, not power, but something smaller, quieter, humility. He had always thought music was about skill, speed, and perfection, but now, as he listened to Clara, he realized something painful. All the applause he had chased, all the stages he had performed on, he had forgotten the one thing that made music real: the heart. Clara didn't need a crowd, or a shiny suit, or a spotlight. Her music was enough. Her music was the spotlight. As she reached the end of the piece, her hands slowed down. The final notes faded like the sun sinking behind a hill. The sound lingered for a moment, then disappeared into complete silence. No one clapped, not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't know how to. The room was too full of emotion, too full of something sacred. Everyone had been taken somewhere far away, and now they were slowly coming back. Clara opened her eyes, looked at the keys for a second, and then stood up. She didn't bow or smile. She simply stepped away from the piano, picked up her apron from the chair, and tied it back around her waist. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her music had already spoken, louder than any voice ever could. And as she walked quietly back toward the hallway, Leonard watched her go. Something heavy settled in his chest. He had mocked her, laughed at her, ignored her, and now, after hearing just one song, he knew the truth. He was not the master in the room anymore. After Clara walked away from the piano, the room was frozen in silence. No one clapped, no one moved, not even Leonard. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes when people are confused. It was the kind that comes when something special happens, something so beautiful that no one wants to break it. Clara didn't look back. She didn't wait for applause or compliments. She quietly walked back toward the hallway, where her mop and cleaning bucket still waited for her. She tied her apron like nothing unusual had happened. But for everyone who had just heard her play, nothing felt the same anymore. The students were still sitting in their seats, eyes wide, lips slightly open. They looked at the piano, then at each other. But no one spoke. Some of them had goosebumps on their arms. One girl blinked several times, like she was trying to wake up from a beautiful dream. A boy whispered, "Was that real?" But no one answered. Eva, the young teacher, wiped another tear from her cheek. She had never cried during a piano performance before, not even at fancy concerts in big cities. But Clara's music had touched something inside her. It was like Clara had opened a door to a hidden room in her heart, a room full of feelings she didn't even know were there. Mr. Heller stood near the wall, holding his clipboard tightly. His eyes were shiny, and he took off his glasses to clean them, even though they weren't dirty. He had always respected Clara, but now he felt something more than respect, something close to awe. He had seen her scrub floors and clean bathrooms for years, but today she had shown a different side of herself, a side full of grace, sadness, love, and music. Even the youngest kids in the room, who usually got bored during slow pieces, had sat quietly the whole time. They didn't fully understand what had just happened, but they knew it was special, and sometimes that's enough. Then, all eyes turned to Leonard. He stood still, not blinking, not speaking. His hands were no longer crossed, and his proud posture had softened. He looked at the piano like it was a stranger, like he was seeing it for the first time again. He had spent his whole life around the best instruments. He had played for kings, queens, and presidents. He had memorized thousands of notes and performed in the grandest halls. But in that moment, none of that felt important, because a woman in simple shoes and a cleaning apron had just reminded him what true music was. And it wasn't pride or power or perfection. It was feeling honesty and soul. He slowly sat down in one of the chairs. His face looked pale, almost lost. For the first time in many years, Leonard Hallberg was silent, not because he was tired, but because he was humbled. The students didn't know what to do. Should they clap now? Say something? Leave? Everything felt different, like they were standing in a new world. A world where the quiet woman in the back had more music in her heart than the loudest performer on stage. Finally, one of the students, a teenage boy named Marco, stood up. He said softly, "She played like she was telling a story." Another girl added, "It made me feel like she understood pain." The group began to speak in low voices, sharing how they felt. No one talked about technique or speed or skill. They talked about emotions, about how the music made them feel inside. Eva walked to the front of the room and placed her hand gently on the piano. She didn't just play notes. She said she played her life. Leonard looked up at her, his eyes tired and thoughtful. He opened his mouth like he was going to speak, but no words came out. He just nodded slowly. Something had changed in him, something big. He had come to this town thinking he was going to teach everyone something important. But now he realized he had been the one who needed to learn, and Clara, the woman he had mocked without a second thought, she had become the teacher. From that moment on, the atmosphere in the room was no longer about fame or who was better at the piano. It was about connection, about heart, about listening to the stories people carry inside them. The piano no longer belonged only to Leonard. It now carried Clara's fingerprints, her soul, her truth. The keys had been touched by something real, and everyone could feel it. The masterclass had started with big names and big egos, but now it was ending with quiet respect. A soft melody still echoing in everyone's minds, even though Clara had gone back to her cleaning. Her music had stayed behind, floating in the air, resting in the hearts of all who had heard it. And no one, especially Leonard, would ever forget it. After the masterclass ended, the students slowly began to leave the room. But no one was talking loudly, and no one was rushing. They walked quietly, still thinking about the music Clara had played. Even after some time had passed, the feeling of her music stayed with them like a soft echo in their hearts. Leonard was still sitting in his chair, staring at the piano. He hadn't moved for a long time. He looked like someone who had just woken up from a powerful dream. The proud, confident look he always wore was gone. Instead, his face looked calm, thoughtful, even a little sad. Eva was the last to leave the room, but before she walked out, she turned to Leonard and said gently, "You should talk to her." Leonard looked up at her, confused for a second. "Talk to who?" He asked. "Clara," she said. "She's more than what you think." He didn't answer, but he nodded slowly. Something inside him told him Eva was right. He stood up, took a deep breath, and walked toward the hallway. Clara was there, wiping the last bit of dust from a windowsill. She didn't notice Leonard at first. Or maybe she did, but chose to act like she didn't. She just kept working with quiet focus, her hands moving slowly and gently, like they had when she played the piano. Leonard stopped a few steps behind her. He waited for a moment, unsure of what to say. Then, in a softer voice than usual, he said, "Clara." She turned around calmly and looked at him with kind but tired eyes. "Yes?" She replied politely. I wanted to say thank you," Leonard said, his voice almost a whisper. "You reminded me of something I forgot a long time ago." Clara gave him a small smile, the kind of smile that holds both pain and peace. "Thank you," she said simply. "I judged you," Leonard continued. "I mocked you. I thought I knew everything about music. But then you played, and it felt like I didn't know anything at all." Clara didn't look angry or upset. She just nodded, as if she had heard these kinds of words before many times. In many ways, after a pause, Leonard asked, "Where did you learn to play like that?" Clara looked down for a moment, her fingers still holding the cleaning cloth. Then she looked up and spoke softly. "I was once a pianist," she said. "A real one, like you." Leonard blinked in surprise. "In Prague," she continued. "I played concerts, taught students, and performed in music halls. I was happy back then. What happened?" Leonard asked quietly, his voice full of curiosity and respect. Clara looked away, her eyes lost in a memory. "There was a car accident," she said slowly. "My husband. He didn't survive, and I broke my arm. It healed, but the music, the feeling, it was gone." Leonard felt a wave of sadness rush through him. He didn't know what to say. Clara continued, "After that, I couldn't play like I used to. I couldn't step on stage again. Every note reminded me of what I had lost." She paused for a moment, then added, "So, I left. I moved here, far from everything I used to be. I took a job cleaning this center because I couldn't stay away from music completely. Even if I couldn't perform, I could still hear the sound of pianos, still smell the wood and the polish. It was enough." Leonard's heart felt heavy. He had spent his life chasing perfection always, trying to be the best. But here was a woman who had walked away from fame, not because she wasn't good enough, but because her heart had been broken. And yet, she had still played. She had still made music that brought people to tears, maybe even better than anything Leonard had played in years. "I'm sorry," he said, "not just for mocking you, but for not seeing you." Clara gave him a kind look. "Most people don't," she said gently, "and that's okay. I don't need to be seen. I just need to feel the music again, even for a moment." Leonard stood there for a few seconds, then asked, "Would you ever play again for people?" Clara shook her head. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Today was the first time in many years that I felt brave enough to try." Leonard nodded, understanding her completely. Then, something inside him changed. For the first time, he didn't want to just teach, perform, or impress. He wanted to help someone else be seen. "Clara," he said, "would you consider joining me at the next masterclass? Not as a cleaner, but as a guest teacher." Clara looked at him in shock. "Me?" she asked softly. "You," Leonard said with a small smile. "You have more to teach than I ever will." Clara didn't answer right away, but in her eyes, something sparkled, a small light, a piece of her old self waking up again. And in that quiet moment, Leonard knew one thing for sure. He had come to this town to teach others. But he would leave having learned the most important lesson of all. The next morning, the air in the small town felt lighter. People were still talking about what happened during the masterclass. But it wasn't Leonard Hallberg they talked about. It was Claroth, the quiet woman with the mop, who had played the piano like an angel. No one could forget the way her music had filled the room, touched their hearts, and brought tears to their eyes. Even those who hadn't attended heard the story. The people at the cafe whispered about her talent. The shopkeeper told customers she played better than anyone I've ever heard. In just one evening, Clara had gone from invisible to unforgettable. Leonard was still in town, staying at a small guest house not far from the community center. He had barely slept that night. He kept thinking about Clara, her story, her music, and the way he had treated her. He felt embarrassed not because his pride had been hurt, but because he had failed to see the beauty and strength in someone who stood right in front of him. He remembered how he had mocked her, laughed at her, and copied her voice to entertain others. Now, those moments made him feel ashamed. He realized how foolish he had been, and how much he still had to learn, not just about music, but about people. That afternoon, Leonard returned to the community center. Clara was outside, watering the small plants near the front steps. She wore the same apron, the same simple shoes, but something in her eyes looked brighter. Like a quiet light had returned to her soul. Leonard walked toward her slowly, not with his usual confidence, but with respect. When Clara saw him, she smiled gently, then stood still, waiting. He stopped in front of her and took a deep breath. "Clara," he said, "I came to say something important." She looked at him calmly. "Yes." "I'm sorry," he said, his voice soft and real. "I judged you without knowing you. I mocked you, made jokes at your expense, and acted like I was better. But after hearing you play, I know now that I was wrong, deeply wrong." Clara didn't say anything right away. She just looked at him, eyes full of understanding. After a moment, she nodded and said, "Thank you for saying that." "I was proud," Leonard continued. "I thought that being a great pianist meant knowing everything, being perfect, having fame. But when you played, I remembered why I started loving music in the first place. You reminded me what it means to feel the music, not just play it." Clara looked down at the watering can in her hands, then back at him. "You know," she said, "there was a time when I also thought being good meant being praised. But life showed me something else. Sometimes the most powerful music comes from silence, from pain, from being invisible." Leonard was quiet, listening closely to every word. Then he said something that surprised even Clara. "Would you come with me? I mean, join me in my next class as a co-teacher." Clara blinked, shocked. "You want me to teach?" She asked softly. "I do," Leonard said. "You have something I lost long ago, something honest, something human. You play with heart, not just hands. And that's the kind of teachers students really need." Clara looked unsure. "I haven't played in front of people for many years, and I'm just a cleaner now." Leonard shook his head gently. "No, Clara, you are not just a cleaner," he said. "You're an artist, a teacher, and someone who made me feel small in the best possible way. You showed me what real greatness looks like." For a moment, Clara stood still, lost in thought. She looked at the piano room through the window. Then she smiled, a real, full smile, the kind that comes after years of hiding. "I don't know if I'm ready," she said, "but maybe one can try." Leonard smiled too, and for the first time in many years. His smile didn't carry pride, it carried respect. He held out his hand, and Clara shook it gently. From that day forward, everything changed. The next time Leonard held a master class, Clara sat beside him. She didn't dress fancy, and she didn't speak loudly. But when she played, the room always fell silent. Students listened to her stories, learned from her experiences. They learned not only how to press the right keys, but how to feel the music inside their hearts. Leonard never forgot that day in the small town. It became the turning point in his life, the moment he stopped performing and started connecting. He and Clara remained friends, partners, and equals together. They helped others find their voice not just through skill, but through emotion, truth, and humility, and the world, even if just a little, became more beautiful because of it.